Hello. So in this video, I'm going to talk about criteria, and this is because of a question that I had on another video, and the question is as follows. Hi, can you do a video on how to establish a criteria? Do you use criteria for every type of essay, or are there some you won't use criteria? So thanks so much for that question. It's a really, really good question, and I'm hoping that this video will really help with that. This idea of criteria is something that I've talked a lot about when I've been teaching A-level history and also tutoring A-level history, and also to history teachers, colleagues. This is something that we've talked about a lot. So bonus marks if you can tell me which in the comments, if you can tell me where that image has come from there, who's written their criteria on that bloodstained document that they're holding. See if you can work it out. Okay. So let's go through the plan for this video. So I'm going to be defining criteria, so what we mean by criteria. Then I'm going to be looking at the mark scheme and where criteria is mentioned. Then I'm going to explain how criteria is used in essays and give 4 examples. Then I'm going to do the same for source questions and then a final summary. So as I say, hopefully this is useful at kind of unpacking that and really getting to grips with what we mean by criteria, because I think it is something that is often kind of overcomplicated. People don't really kind of understand it. So first off, what is criteria? So this is the definition: a principle or standard by which something may be judged or decided. So it's the basis of your argument. If you say that one factor is more important than the others, why is that? The answer to the why is your criteria. Okay, so a principle or standard by which something may be judged or decided. If you're saying one source is more important than the other, why is that? Then the answer to the why again is your criteria. Okay, so that's what we mean by criteria, how you are judging something. So in the mark scheme, for source questions and essay questions, the word criteria comes up. So in the source question, this is level 5. Evaluation of source material evaluation of source material uses valid criteria which are justified and fully applied. So valid criteria, so something which is useful. It's not something that isn't valid, not useful. Justified and fully applied. And then for the essay question, valid criteria by which the question can be judged are established and applied, ... So valid criteria. So it's about how you're judging the things that you're talking about. Okay, so valid criteria comes up in the mark scheme for sources and essays. So let's start off talking about essays. So criteria is the basis of your argument. So as I said before, if you're saying X is the most important reason, why is that? So if you're saying it had a more widespread impact, yeah, it was the catalyst that caused, those kind of things. That is your criteria. As I say in the next bullet point, criteria should be used in your introduction to define key terms. So that's how you create criteria, or a way of creating criteria, and it also supports your argument. I'll give some examples of this. And then within your paragraphs, the criteria is your analysis. So if you give a piece of evidence, then you say, well, to what extent was that widespread or long-term, or however you've defined the key terms. And then in the conclusion, when you're substantiating your overall judgment, why one factor, one cause, one reason, one event is the most important, the answer to the why should be linked to your criteria again. Okay, so hopefully it's most useful for me to give some examples. So here we go. So I've got a few examples of how to create criteria from a definition. Okay, so here is just some questions that I've come up with. They are kind of based on different papers that these kind of could come up. So how far do you agree that World War I was the most significant turning point for the changing geographical distributions of Black Americans in the years 1850 to 2009. So I'm not going to go through this intro. I've done an essay. I've done a video on intros. But you do your context 1850 to 2009, and then your definition. So the key term in this question is turning point, isn't it? Because you're kind of assessing which was the most significant turning point. So then in your intro, if you define turning point, if you said a turning point is something which causes widespread, unprecedented, and long-term change, You've created your criteria. That's how you're weighing up turning points. So then your argument, it naturally is going to be, if you agree with the question, and for this instance I have, World War I was the most significant as other periods did not bring about as much widespread, unprecedented, and long-term change as World War I. So you've used your criteria to back up your argument. And then, for example, if we go into a paragraph on this, and you're talking about the Great Migration, for example, as an example in your World War I paragraph, you'd say the Great Migration led to an unprecedented amount of migration. Millions of Black Americans moved from the South to the North. So that is using your criteria to back up your argument. So I hope that makes sense there. We've defined the key term in the question, and that's created criteria. In this one, the key term is turning point. That's what we're assessing. So think about, what are we assessing here? What are we assessing in the question? It gives you a factor. So World War I is the kind of factor, the turning point, the first turning point, but we're assessing it against other turning points. Okay, so another example just to back this up. So the question this time is, how far do you agree that Charles I's actions were the most significant cause of political instability in the years 25 to 42? So again, obviously you do context, but then what are we assessing? We're assessing political instability. So if you define political instability as divisions, unpopularity, conflict between the monarch and parliament, then your argument could be something like, Charles I's actions were not the most significant. The root cause of conflict between the monarch and parliament was religious divisions, which exacerbated tensions. So you're using your criteria to weigh up the factors. And then in your paragraphs, you would talk about divisions, unpopularity, conflict. That would be the analysis of the different pieces of evidence. So that's the second example. A further example, this question that I've just come up with, the civil rights movement in the years 65 to 68 was a failure. How far do you agree with this assessment? So then you would define, you've obviously done context, you'd define, what do we mean by failure? So you'd say inability to achieve its goals. That's a failure if you don't achieve your goals. Obviously, you could define this differently. This is what I've just kind of come up with. And you'd say the goals were social, political, and economic equality. So your argument then could be, it is incorrect to characterize the civil rights movement as a failure between 65 to 68, as significant legislation was passed to improve social and political position of Black Americans. However, the movement had less success economically, and obviously you could develop that slightly more. So then within your paragraphs, you would talk about the extent to which the civil rights movement achieved its goals or not. So was it a failure or not? And then you come back to these ideas of social, political, and economic equality, because they were the goals. So that's your kind of criteria for judging it. Now, sometimes, and this goes back to the question, do you have criteria in every essay? Yes, you should. That's the answer to that. You should. But there might be something where there's not as obvious a point to define. Right, so in your essay question might be something so obvious that you think, well, I don't really need to define anything here. So you can come up with criteria from your argument. Okay, so here's an example. The actions of Parliament were most to blame for the outbreak of civil war in 1642. How far do you agree in relation to the years 1629 to 42? So this question, 29 to 42, was it the actions of Parliament that were most to blame for the outbreak of civil war? And if you were to define something, it would be kind of most to blame for the outbreak of civil war. But you think, well, that's kind of pretty obvious. It's not, don't necessarily need to break it down. You could define that. But you can also come up with criteria from your argument. And as I said right at the start, it's the basis of your argument. So here we go. Actions of Parliament not as significant as the actions of Charles I, as he worsened tensions and increased divisions through his choice of advisors and policies. So what I've underlined there is the criteria. That's why the actions of Charles were more significant than the actions of Parliament. He worsened tensions and increased divisions. Which led to the outbreak of the Civil War, obviously. So that's how to do it from your argument. The basis of your argument can also create criteria. If you can't work out what you need to define, just say, well, why is my argument the case? Okay. Now, in sources, actually, I think this is more straightforward, because basically the easiest way to think of how to use criteria in sources is how you reach your judgment on the source, so the value of the source. So for example, if you're saying the source is most useful for the first inquiry because it's more clearly focused on those issues, and the author is in a better position to comment as they have first-hand experience, for example. That's just an example I just wrote. That's your criteria. They're more focused. They have first-hand experience. That is your criteria. That's why you're saying it's more useful for one inquiry than the other. Or if you're saying one source is more important than another, you might say it's because it's more directly related. They've got more experience of that issue or whatever. So criteria is just how you judge something. So in summary, criteria is the basis of your argument, how you are judging something. And it's useful to create criteria in essays by defining the key terms in question. So if you do that, then you can go back to those points throughout your essay, in your analysis, in your paragraphs, and also in your conclusion. So think of it as the basis for your argument, how you are judging something. I hope that was useful. If you have a look at my other videos, on essay writing technique, I've also spoken about this. This video is obviously just on criteria. So I hope that's useful. Any other comments, questions, or suggestions, please leave a comment below. Thank you for listening.